Hello everybody, this is David Farrell with another music theory video. Today's video talks about enharmonic modulation and about mediant relationships, and in particular chromatic mediant relationships. Both of these are topics that have to do with chromatic music, that have to do with some of the more tricky progressions that we can find and tricky interactions that we can find between chords in chromatic music, and so we'll be going into the basics for each of these. Let's get started. Enharmonic modulation. Enharmonic modulation is the first thing we're going to be talking about today, and enharmonic modulation is a particular type of common chord modulation that we can find in some chromatic music. We remember talking about common chord or pivot chord modulation from some of our previous videos, where we have a chord that belongs to two different keys and it serves as sort of the bridge or transition between those keys. Enharmonic modulation uses this principle. It uses the principle of a chord that belongs to two different keys. But it takes advantage of a particular relationship that we can find in some chords, which is enharmonic equivalence. And this goes back all the way to the old days of learning about music theory. Enharmonic equivalence is what we talk about when we talk about sounds that we hear as the same but look differently in music, right? A sharp and B flat, for instance, are enharmonically equivalent pitches because they sound the same, but we write them differently. And in enharmonic modulation, we take a chord that can be interpreted as in different ways based on how it's spelled. We have two common chords that are used for enharmonic modulations: dominant seventh chords or fully diminished seventh chords. Both of these have some enharmonic possibilities that allow us to do some tricky and interesting and fun modulations with them. Let's look at each and see how they can be used to accomplish an enharmonic modulation. Enharmonic modulation with dominant seventh chords. The sound of a dominant seventh chord has two different jobs in tonal music, depending on how the chord is spelled, right? And we can look at my first two examples here. We have two chords that sound the exact same. They have a D and an A in the bass clef staff. They have an F sharp, and one of them has a C natural, and one of them has a B sharp in the soprano part. Both of them are going to sound the exact same. One of them, D, F sharp, A, C, the first one, we would expect to function as a dominant chord in the key of G major, as a 5/7 chord. The other one, D, F sharp, A, B sharp, we would expect to function as an augmented sixth chord, as a German augmented sixth chord, probably in the key of F sharp, maybe minor, maybe major, doesn't matter, but in some sort of F sharp tonality. When we use these chords for an enharmonic modulation, we get to use this ambiguity to our advantage. We get to use the fact that this sonority can do two different things to our advantage. And so we might set up an expectation, a tonal expectation for this chord to resolve one way, but then in the music, twist it and resolve it the other way to accomplish a modulation to a pretty distant key. We have a short chorale that follows here, and it begins in the key of G major. And if we look at the first chord in the second measure, we do see that dominant seventh sound, an incomplete 5/7, a D, an F sharp, and a C natural. The same chord shows up at the beginning of measure 3, a D, an F sharp, here a full chord with an A, and that same C natural, but now it's been spelled enharmonically as a B sharp. The first time I encountered the chord, I resolved it like I would in the key of G as a dominant chord. The second time, however, this chord serves to pivot me out of G major and into F sharp minor. I resolve it instead as an augmented sixth chord. This is an enharmonic modulation. It uses an enharmonic reinterpretation of a chord to accomplish a modulation, here from the key of G major to a relatively distant key, the key of F sharp minor. Let's take a listen to this chord progression. A surprising twist. The first time we hear that D chord, it functions as 5/7. The second time, It twists on us, and it functions instead as the German augmented sixth. That ambiguity is used to great effect in a lot of music to accomplish an enharmonic modulation. We have other chords that we can use to accomplish enharmonic modulations as well. The other chord that we use most frequently is the 7 fully diminished seventh chord. Every fully diminished seventh chord has 3 other chords which are its enharmonic equivalents. Let's take a look at the chords I've given you here as an example. Each of them looks different, but each of them actually sounds the same. They each have a G sharp or an A flat in the bass. They each have a B natural or a C flat in the tenor. They each have a D natural in the alto, and they each have an F natural or an E sharp in the soprano. Each of them has the exact same pitches, but they're all spelled a little differently. Each of them then implies a different key. The first, a G sharp fully diminished seventh chord, would suggest a key of A minor. The second, spelled as a B fully diminished seventh chord, would imply the key of C minor. The third, spelled as a D fully diminished seventh chord, would imply a key of E flat minor, and the final, an E sharp fully diminished seventh chord, would imply a key of F sharp. All of these chords sound the same, but they can all point towards a different tonality. Well, you might be able to guess what the enharmonic possibilities are. If we're in one of these keys, we can use a 7 chord to shift us, to pivot us, to one of the other keys. And so I can be walking around in A minor and all of a sudden use my G sharp fully diminished 7 chord enharmonically as a D chord to modulate to a very distant key like E flat minor. Enharmonic modulation with a fully diminished 7 chord has a lot of possibilities. These chords are very, very flexible. And so when we see these sorts of resolutions, we just want to be paying attention for them. Let's take a look at another example. This chorale begins in E minor, and it uses the same 7 fully diminished 7 chord 2 times. The first time is in the second half of measure 1, and there we see it a D sharp in the bass, a C in the tenor, an F sharp in the alto, and an A in the soprano, and it resolves as we'd expect it to, right back to the tonic. In measure 3, we get the same chord, same voicing, right? Except it looks quite a bit different, doesn't it? We have an E flat in the bass. We have a C in the tenor. We have a G flat in the alto and an A in the soprano. This is the exact same harmony, right? It sounds the exact same. In this case, the exact same notes are all in the exact same places. But we're taking advantage of the fact that fully diminished 7th chords have these enharmonic possibilities to pivot away from the key of E towards the key of B flat. We instead interpret this chord as an A fully diminished 7th chord rather than a D sharp fully diminished 7th chord, and we finish our phrase in the key of B flat minor rather than the key of E. Let's listen to this enharmonic modulation using a fully diminished 7th chord. The effect is, of course, similar to the previous example that used a dominant chord. We get to modulate to a very distant place, from a key with 1 sharp to a key with 5 flats in this particular case. And we get to do it using a smooth and familiar resolution. We just play these little enharmonic tricks to get there. So when we see these fully diminished 7th chords that look quite odd, or when we see dominant chords or German augmented 6th chords in places we don't expect, and we see them moving towards odd cadences, we want to remember that this is a possibility, that we can use the fact that these chords sound the same but have different functions to our advantage in music. And when we're studying music that uses these techniques, we don't want to be blindsided. We want to remember that these are nice options for surprising modulations. We can go into more depth about those key relationships because we've seen some modulations that go pretty far. Enharmonic modulations that use dominant 7th pivoting to a German augmented 6th allow for modulation between keys whose tonics are a half step apart. For example, a G7 chord can resolve as a 5 chord in C major or C minor. It can also resolve as though it were a German augmented sixth chord in the key of B major or minor. This means that it can serve to pivot us between those two chords a half step apart. If we want to write a modulation that moves by half step, or if we find one in music that moves by half step, this might be a strategy that is useful to get us there. Enharmonic modulations using 7 fully diminished 7 allow for modulations between keys whose tonics are a minor third or tritone apart. For example, a D-sharp fully diminished 7th chord can resolve to any number of keys. It can resolve to E minor. It can resolve to a key a minor third up, G major or minor. It can resolve to a key a minor third down from E, to C sharp major or minor, and we might even see it spelled as D flat major or minor. And it can resolve to the keys a tritone away from E, to B flat major or minor. Again, these fully diminished 7th chords have a lot of possibilities, and so there are many options. If we see these modulations by minor third or by tritone, then a fully diminished 7th chord used to be an enharmonic pivot chord might be a strategy that we're finding in our music. I want to wrap up today by talking about key relations a little bit more. We just talked about how these enharmonic modulations allow us to move to very distant keys. And in previous videos and previous studies, we've talked about key relationships, about parallel keys and relative keys, about closely related keys and distantly related keys, or foreign keys. Today we're going to talk about another type of relationship that we can have between keys, which is mediant relationships. Keys whose tonics are a third apart are said to have a mediant relationship. And we remember that mediant is the name of scale degree 3 in our scales, so it shouldn't be surprising that it's related to thirds. The tonic triads of mediant relationship keys have two tones with the same letter name, and this means that there's a pretty smooth connection between a lot of these mediant keys. This is nice for a lot of music that wants to move between these keys, because you're allowed to keep a lot of these notes. We can have direct modulations to mediant keys and keep some of our pitches the same to help smooth out that transition. We have a couple of different ways we can describe the mediant relationships depending on what accidentals may be used from our original key to later keys. When two of the shared notes are the same, the keys have simply a mediant relationship, or we might say a diatonic mediant relationship. If we look at C major and E minor, both keys have a tonic triad with an E natural and a G natural, the exact same notes. This is a mediant relationship, or a diatonic mediant relationship. But when one of the shared notes becomes chromatically altered, we have another way to describe it. We call this a chromatic mediant relationship. We can look at the two keys in the middle here, F major and A major. Their tonic triads both share an A and a C, but note that in A major, the C becomes C sharp. They have one note that's exactly the same, which is A natural, and they have one note which is a chromatically altered note, C to C sharp. This means that F major and A major have a chromatic mediant relationship. If we look at our last two keys, D major and B flat minor, we note that both tonic triads have a D and an F, but in this case both pitches have been chromatically altered. The D in D major becomes D flat in B flat minor. The F sharp in D major becomes F natural in B flat minor. We call this a doubly chromatic mediant relationship. Chromatic mediant relationships occur a lot in romantic music. They allow for a striking contrast between keys that tend to be foreign related keys. They're not closely related keys. They're keys that don't have a lot of notes in common. But because the tonic triads have some notes that are very similar, the voice leading can be smooth, and so it allows for a nice connection between keys while still having a surprise of adding a bunch of accidentals to your key signature. As you study romantic music, you want to be on the lookout for chromatic mediant relationships or doubly chromatic mediant relationships. They tend to produce surprising and bold harmonic sounds, and they tend to be something that we find a lot in exciting music. So these are terms that we want to keep in mind. For the sake of practice, let's look at some mediant relationships with our old friend C major. The tonic triad of C major is of course spelled C-E-G. Our diatonic mediant keys include A minor and E minor. A minor shares C natural and E natural with our C major tonality, and E minor shares E natural and G natural with our C major tonality. Two shared pitches, and they have not been chromatically altered. These are simple mediants, diatonic mediants. We have four chromatic mediant keys. A flat major shares C and E, but the E has been altered to E flat. One note is exactly the same, the C. One is chromatically altered. The E has become E flat. A flat major has a chromatic mediant relationship with C major. A major does as well. Here, again, the pitches shared are C and E. The E natural is the same in both C major and A major's tonic triads, but A major has a C sharp, where C major has C natural. The E natural is the same. The C has been chromatically altered to C sharp. A major is also a chromatic mediant relationship key with C major. E major shares E and G. The E natural is the same, but the G has been altered to G sharp, which again makes it a chromatic mediant. And finally, E flat major also shares an E and a G. Here, the E natural from C major has been made into E flat, but the G natural has stayed the same. And we have two doubly chromatic mediant keys with C major. A flat minor has an C and an E, but both have been changed. C natural has become C flat, E natural has become E flat. Two letter names in common, but both changed chromatically means a doubly chromatic mediant, and likewise with E flat minor. E and G are both present, but they've both been changed from natural to flat, which means this tonality is also has a doubly chromatic mediant relationship with C major. This is just an example of going through all the different mediant relationships with C major. We might see any of these in a particular music. It would be a pretty crazy piece that would use all of them, but wouldn't that be fun too? This is another key relationship we want to keep in mind. Mediant relationships, very common in Romantic music. Chromatic mediants in particular, very common. And so we want to understand the terminology, be able to use it, be able to find these relationships in the music that we perform and that we study. That's the end. We talked about enharmonic modulations today. We talked about using dominant and fully diminished seventh chords and enharmonically reinterpreting them to use them as pivot chords to make some daring modulations in our music. We also talked about mediant relationships between keys, diatonic, chromatic, doubly chromatic even. These are some of the key relationships we will encounter in some of the more chromatic music that we look at, and in particular some of the music that uses these enharmonic modulation techniques. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have questions. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.